A tree just crashed into your rental property. Your tenant's hurt, and you go to file an insurance claim and you find out you're completely uncovered. Why? It's because you had homeowners insurance instead of landlord insurance. And now you're on the hook for $100,000 in repairs and legal fees. And that's not a horror story. It can really happen if you don't understand your insurance policy. If we haven't met yet, I'm Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach Carson, and I've been investing in real estate for over 22 years. And today I'm going to explain the real difference between homeowners insurance and landlord insurance, and answer the biggest, messiest questions I've gotten from real investors just like you. Let's get started. So let's talk about the difference between homeowners insurance and landlord insurance. And I can make this very simple. Homeowners insurance is for the place that you live in. This is where you sleep. This is where you eat. This is where you have all your stuff. And if you have a fire or a storm or some other kind of damage, this insurance pays to repair the property. It pays to replace your personal belongings. And it usually pays for you to live somewhere while you can't live in the house if you're having to build it back or repair it. And this kind of insurance also helps you if you accidentally hurt someone, like if your dog bites a neighbor or if they slip and fall on your sidewalk. The insurance would help compensate you to pay for those issues. So landlord insurance, I can explain really simply too. You still own the property, or you have an LLC or another entity that owns the property, but you don't live there. Instead, you have a tenant who is paying rent to you who lives in the property, but you still want to protect the property itself, and you want to protect yourself in case you were sued or someone got hurt on the property. And that's what landlord insurance does. It pays for replacing or repairing the property in case of damage from a storm or a fire or something. It covers you in the legal cost in case someone got hurt at the property. And it typically pays for lost rent during the time when you're repairing and fixing the property back up, because your tenant might not be able to live there and pay rent during a 6 to 12 month period, but you still have mortgage payments, you still have other expenses on the property. So lost rent coverage is very important for you as a landlord. But one important thing that landlord insurance does not cover is all of the tenant's belongings. So if they have computers and they have personal items in the property, your landlord insurance does not cover their stuff. So there's another type of insurance called renter's insurance, which you should recommend or require your tenants to have. And I'll tell a real quick story that shows the relationship between landlord insurance and renter's insurance. So fortunately, I haven't had many times during my 22-year career where I've needed my insurance, but a few years back, I got a call that you never want to get from your property manager that says you've had a fire at one of your apartments in Clemson and everybody's okay. That was the first good news, that none of the tenants were hurt, but it's been a pretty significant damage inside the apartment, and this was actually a fourplex. So one unit was very much damaged, the other units had smoke damage, and everyone is having to move out, and you might want to go take a look at it. So I did go take a look at it, and pretty soon after that, I called my insurance company and found out the claims process and the person I had to call. And so we filed a claim to help replace and fix everything and clean everything up. But what I also found out during this process was my tenant, it wasn't a deliberate act, but they had actually left some groceries when they were just moving into the property on the stove and somehow had hit the little, the on button on the stove, and they went to the store to buy some more stuff. They came back and the house was on fire. So that was recorded by the fire marshal when they interviewed everybody to find out what was going on. So ultimately it was my tenant's responsibility, and they had tenant insurance. They had renter's insurance on the property as well. So their renter's insurance covered their personal belongings first and foremost, but there's actually an interesting process because typically if there's a fire, my insurance company would have to pay for all the damage, but there's a process called a subrogation, which you don't have to remember this term, but basically my insurance company paid for the repairs up front, and then they went back to the insurance company of my tenant to get compensated for that. So for me, that was a good thing on my insurance because that claim ultimately wasn't on my record as someone filing a claim, which can be an issue if you repeatedly file a lot of claims on your insurance. Your premiums might go up, or in some cases they might not even cover you. So in my case, the tenant's insurance paid for all that damage and paid for my deductible on the property as well. So here's the important thing to know. Of these three types of insurance, homeowners insurance, landlord insurance, and renter's insurance, the insurance companies behind the scenes look at each one of those very differently. They have different levels of risk. They have different costs associated with them. So if you are a landlord, you're renting the property out, and you still have homeowners insurance, they have in the fine print of their insurance policy, just take a look at it if you want to verify this, they would not cover losses, or they don't have to cover losses if you switch from being a homeowner to being a landlord, or vice versa. So you have to have the right policy for the right situation if you actually want to make sure you can get all the coverage that they promise in the policy. That's the big takeaway that you want to know up front. So next, I want to share several other landlord insurance gotchas that you definitely want to know about. But before I do, I want to talk about the sponsor of this video, which appropriately enough is Steadily Landlord Insurance. I actually switched one of my personal rental properties to Steadily, and what impressed me the most about them is they're built by landlords, so they actually get what we need. You can compare quotes instantly online, you can get expert help, and you can lock in rates in just minutes. As I said, I'm a happy customer, and thousands of other real estate investors are too. If you want to get a quote or check them out, just visit coachcarson.com/landlord insurance. You can also click on the link in the podcast or the YouTube description below and let them know that Coach sent you. So we've covered the basics of landlord insurance, but I learned a tough lesson recently that the most important part of your insurance policy is often what it does not cover, not just what it does cover. I'll tell you a brief story about that. I was talking to my property manager who had a tenant who wanted to rent one of our properties, and the property manager asked me, hey, they have this breed of dog. Would your insurance company allow you to be able to rent to them with that breed of dog? And I said, good question. I don't know. So I did what a lot of people do lately. I uploaded my insurance policy to ChatGPT, and I told them the situation. Say we have a tenant who wants to rent the property with this breed of dog. Would I be okay? Would I be covered? Are there any exemptions or problems with that in my insurance policy? It looks through there. It has a conversation with me about it. It says, actually, you don't have any insurance coverage for dog bites, that your insurance company, and this was not my Steadily policy, this is another policy, by the way, they specifically exempt any problems where a dog is involved of your tenant. That was news to me. I didn't realize that. Shame on me for not really thoroughly reading my insurance policy. But that is an example of a gap in coverage or something where I need to get optional coverage, add-on coverage to help cover things that my base policy does not. So in my particular example, what I needed was additional coverage to cover dog bites. So if your landlord insurance covers that, if they're willing to cover it, you could pay extra to have that covered. But I want to talk about some other common things that you might want to consider adding on to your landlord insurance policy, or at least talking to your insurance agent about. One of the first kinds of add-on insurance that I like to consider is something called umbrella insurance. So remember, with landlord policies, one of the types of coverage you have is if someone gets hurt on the property or they sue you, you have coverage to help you with your legal costs and to cover that liability that you have. But typically there's a cap on how much they'll pay. It might be $300,000. It might be, you can raise it up to $500,000. That's been kind of the cap I've seen on my policies. But what happens if you have a lawsuit for more than that? What if someone wins a lawsuit for $1 million and your cap is $500,000? Well, in that case, your insurance company would pay up to $500,000, the $500,000, and you'd be on the hook for the rest of it. So this is where an umbrella policy can kick in. You basically get a separate or an add-on insurance policy that will kick in only after you reach the limit on your other policies. So you might get, for example, one $3 million policy that would cover all of your properties. Like if you had multiple properties, it might be for all of those, and then it would only kick in anytime you got above the limit on your existing policies. Now, the thing is, it's actually pretty cheap typically compared to your regular insurance policy. You can get a quote and find out, but this is a more rare instance where you have those big claims, but if they do happen, it's something you want to be covered for. So having umbrella policies can be a really smart move as a landlord. Another type of add-on or variation of landlord insurance you might want to look at is if you do anything but regular old long-term rentals. So if you do short-term rentals like Airbnb, if you do mid-term rentals, or even if you do student rentals, which is the case for me, you want to talk to your insurance agent and make sure that the coverage you have actually allows that. So with Steadily, for example, you can get a separate policy for your short-term rentals or your mid-term rentals. And you can also, in some cases with other insurance companies, get an add-on to your property. But if you don't tell them that, and if you don't have that specifically included in your coverage, there might be an exemption where they say, if you're doing a short-term rental or if you're doing this other type of rental, we don't cover that. So you want to make sure you disclose that up front and get the right kind of coverage for your rental strategy. Another big one that's been in the news lately around insurance is making sure you have natural disasters covered. So if you live in an area that's prone to earthquakes, for example, in Southern California, or wildfires, or even flood insurance, which a lot of people that I know in Western North Carolina had to deal with whenever Hurricane Helene came in through last year. If you don't have specific coverage for that type of natural disaster, it might be left out of your normal landlord insurance. So I heard just anecdotally stories. I don't know people specifically who had this happen, but in Western North Carolina, many of these people don't live near the ocean. So they didn't have extra coverage for flood insurance, but because a river went over its banks and washed through their house and they had all sorts of damage, that wasn't included. Their coverage did include if a hot water heater burst and flooded the house, and it did include a fire if something like that happened, or wind damage from a tornado, but it did not include flood from the outside. So that's one of those little details you got to check. Earthquakes, flood, all those types of things, you want to make sure specifically it's covered if that's something you're concerned about. And if it's not covered, you have to get a rider, an additional coverage to your policy. One other kind of add-on coverage that you might want to consider as a landlord is something called ordinance or law coverage. And as someone with older properties, this is something I've become more familiar with, is let's say you had a claim where a property was damaged because of fire or a tree fell on it, and your insurance company says after you file a claim, we will pay you to fix it back the way it was. But what if when you went to get your permits to repair the property, the city inspectors said, well, because you had this much damage, we now require you to upgrade the entire property to today's codes. So your property was built in 1940 when they didn't follow these codes. Maybe the electrical system didn't have a certain kind of wiring. Maybe there's sprinkler systems and now they require you to put a sprinkler system in a commercial property. Maybe there's just some other kind of requirement that you didn't fit before because you were grandfathered in, but now they're requiring you to do that. That could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of extra money. So an ordinance or law coverage would cover the additional cost, even though it was more than what the replacement cost was, to meet the requirements of the city or the municipality who's requiring you to do that. Now, how do you know whether you need this situation? This is something you could talk to your insurance agent about. You can show them the age of the property. You can even talk to your local zoning officials and just say, hey, here's a property I have. If it burned down, what would apply here? What would you make me do? And they'll tell you, they can give you some insights into what would happen in that case. So I've received some really good questions about landlord insurance on some of my other YouTube videos in the comments, and I want to address a couple of those here. The first is, what if you're using house hacking? Should you get landlord insurance? Should you get homeowners insurance? It's kind of a gray area. And the short answer is it depends, and you have to ask your insurance agent. The reason is every insurance company can define what is a landlord insurance and what's homeowners insurance differently. So in some cases, if you're living in a house and you have one bedroom that's rented out to somebody else, they might look at that as a homeowner's policy, and they just have an add-on for a landlord policy, just a little bit extra to cover that situation with the one person living there. There might be other situations where you're living in a fourplex and you have one unit and the other 3 units are out. They're rented out. That's clearly a landlord policy, and they require you to get a landlord policy, and then you have additional coverage, some of your personal belongings in there. So you just have to ask, and you have to explain your situation to your insurance agent, and that's where a good, knowledgeable insurance agent really comes in. If they understand your situation, they'll go to the underwriter, the person who actually funds the insurance for you, and ask them which type of policy they would like to see. Another related question is, what if you have a family member or someone else you're letting live for free in your rental property? Do you still have to have a landlord insurance policy in that case? And the answer is you might. This is another one where you have to ask your insurance company because every one of them looks at it a little differently. You might have some companies who say, well, if you're not receiving any monetary value, any rent, then it's not a landlord policy. You might have others who say, well, if you're not living there, that is a landlord policy and you need to have one of those. So you need to ask, be upfront. And really this is the ethos or the idea of this entire part of the episode is the bigger risk is not having coverage in case you need it. So just making a call, even if you have to pay a little bit higher premium for the right policy, the cost of having a claim where you have $100,000 and you have to come out of pocket because you got the wrong coverage is not worth messing with. There's other things you should be paying attention to with your landlord business, not trying to save a couple $100 on your insurance policy. All right, we've covered a lot, like what landlord insurance actually covers, some add-ons you should consider, and some tricky situations like house hacking or renting to family. But now you might be wondering, does my current policy actually cover all of this? That's exactly what I was wondering recently, and I recommend doing what I did, using ChatGPT or some kind of AI tool to help you figure it out. Now, as with any AI tool, this isn't a replacement for actually having a conversation with your insurance agent or with an attorney, but I found it's a really good way to spot missing coverages, to understand confusing vocabulary, and then to prepare a list of questions for your insurance agent. And actually put together a simple guide you can use. You can just copy and paste the scripts that I have in this free download, and you can put them into ChatGPT and then help you understand your current policy. You can download that for free at coachcarson.com/insurance-prompts. You can see a link in the podcast or the YouTube description below. And if you want an insurance company that already understands what real estate investors need, go check out Steadily, the sponsor of this video. They're built by landlords for landlords. I'm a customer myself. And you can get a quote in just a few minutes at coachcarson.com/landlord insurance. There'll also be a link to that in the YouTube and the podcast description below. And if you want to go even deeper on insurance, including how to save money on your premiums and avoid some of the biggest risks that we landlords face, I recommend watching my next video. It's an interview I did with the founder of Steadily, Darren Nix, and we covered 5 major risks that landlords face and how to avoid them. You can click on the thumbnail above me here in the video, or you can click on the link in the podcast or the YouTube description below. Click that link and I'll see you in the next video.